I want to start with two facts, and I want you to hold them side by side, because the space between them is one of the great betrayals in modern American history. Fact 1. In the 1980s, a wave of cheap, smokable cocaine called crack tore through black neighborhoods in Los Angeles and other American cities, destroying lives, families, and whole communities with a speed and ferocity that's hard to describe. Fact 2. Some of the men who flooded that cocaine into Los Angeles were connected to a U.S.-backed army, were known to the United States government, and were protected from prosecution, while the young black men who sold it on the corner were sentenced to die in prison. The suppliers at the top got a pass. The kids at the bottom got the cell. That is not a conspiracy theory. The core of it was confirmed by the government's own Inspector General. And the part that is a conspiracy theory, the idea that the CIA sat in a room and deliberately invented crack to destroy Black America. I'm going to be honest with you and tell you the evidence does not support. But here's the thing. You don't need the conspiracy theory. The documented truth is damning enough. The real story is that the United States government knowingly protected a drug pipeline because the men running it were useful to a secret war. And then it turned around and waged a different war, a war on drugs, against the very communities that pipeline poisoned. They shielded the dealers at the top and imprisoned a generation at the bottom. Let me walk you through all of it, carefully, because this story has been buried, distorted, and lied about for 40 years, and the people who paid for it deserve the truth. Let's set the scene. South Central Los Angeles, the early 1980s. These were Black working-class neighborhoods that had already been hit hard. The good factory jobs that once sustained them were vanishing as industry left the city, unemployment was climbing, and the social safety net was being cut. Into that landscape of shrinking opportunity came a new product. Cocaine had been around for years, but it was expensive, a rich person's drug, a Hollywood drug. Then someone figured out the chemistry that would change everything. If you take powder cocaine and cook it with baking soda and water, it hardens into small, smokable rocks. Crack. And crack changed the economics of the drug completely. It was cheap. You could buy a rock for a few dollars. It delivered an intense, immediate high, and it was ferociously addictive. Suddenly, a drug that had been out of reach was available on the corner for the price of a meal, in a form that hooked people almost instantly. It spread through South Central like a fire through dry brush. And to understand how it spread, you have to understand one man. Freeway, Rick Ross. Rick Ross, and this is years before the rapper took his name, grew up poor in South Central. He was, by his own account, functionally illiterate. He'd gone through the L.A. school system and come out unable to read, a kid who fell through every crack the system had. He'd been a gifted tennis player with dreams of a scholarship, but those dreams collapsed. And in the early 1980s, he found his way into the cocaine business. What made Rick Ross extraordinary was that he had a head for it, a genius for logistics and scale that in another life would have made him a Fortune 500 executive. He didn't just deal, he built an empire. At his peak, Freeway Rick Ross was reportedly moving hundreds of kilograms of cocaine and by some accounts, taking in $1 million or more a day. He set up a distribution network that stretched out of L.A. into cities across the country. He got the nickname Freeway because of his properties along the Harbor Freeway and his ability to move product down those highways. He was, for a few years, one of the biggest crack dealers in America. But Rick Ross was not the top of the pyramid. He was the retail end. The question that matters, the question Gary Webb would later ask and pay for asking, is, Where did Freeway Rick Ross get all that cocaine? Who was his supplier? Because no illiterate kid from South Central has a direct line to Colombian cocaine cartels. Somebody connected him to that supply. And the answer is where this story stops being a local crime saga and becomes a national scandal. Rick Ross's main supplier was a man named Oscar Danilo Blandón. And Blandón was not a typical drug dealer. He was a Nicaraguan exile, an educated man, reportedly with a background in marketing, who had fled Nicaragua after the leftist Sandinista revolution of 1979 overthrew the U.S.-backed Somoza dictatorship. Blandón was a committed opponent of the Sandinistas, and he was selling cocaine in Los Angeles, by his own later testimony, in significant part to raise money for a cause, the Contras. So now we have to talk about the Contras, because they are the engine of this entire story. After the Sandinistas took power in Nicaragua, the Reagan administration became obsessed with overthrowing them. This was the Cold War. Reagan saw the leftist Sandinista government as a Soviet beachhead in Central America, and he was determined to destroy it. So the United States, through the CIA, organized, funded, armed, and trained a guerrilla army of Nicaraguan rebels to wage war against the Sandinista government. These rebels were called the Contras. Reagan called them the moral equal of our founding fathers. Their actual conduct on the ground, which included widespread atrocities against civilians, was a great deal uglier than that. But to Reagan, they were freedom fighters, and supporting them was a holy mission. There was just one enormous problem. The American Congress did not want to fund this war. Public opinion was against it, and so Congress passed a series of laws, the Boland Amendments, that cut off and ultimately banned U.S. military aid to the Contras. The CIA's war was, in effect, made illegal by the people's representatives, but the Reagan administration was not willing to let it die. So they went looking for other ways to keep the Contras funded and armed, off the books, outside the law, hidden from Congress. This is the secret enterprise that would eventually blow up into the Iran-Contra scandal, run substantially out of the National Security Council by a Marine lieutenant colonel named Oliver North, who helped orchestrate a covert network to illegally resupply the Contras. And when you have a covert army that desperately needs money, and you have ideological allies of that army who happen to be sitting on top of the most lucrative cash crop on earth, cocaine, you can see where this is going. This is the heart of what the journalist Gary Webb uncovered. In August of 1996, Webb, working for the San Jose Mercury News, published a 3-part series called Dark Alliance, and in it he traced exactly the pipeline I've been describing. That Nicaraguan Contra sympathizers and traffickers, Danilo Blandón, and a bigger figure above him named Norwin Meneses, a man known in the drug world as the King of Drugs, had sold tons of cocaine in Los Angeles, that this cocaine had helped fuel the explosion of crack in the city through dealers like Freeway Rick Ross, and that profits from this drug trafficking had flowed back to the CIA-backed Contras, a drug pipeline, feeding the crack epidemic in Black L.A., with a direct line to a U.S. covert operation. Webb's reporting connected the crack on the corner to the Cold War in Washington. Now I have to be very careful and very honest here, because this is exactly where the story has been distorted in both directions for decades. Let me tell you what is solidly established and what is not. What is established, and this is extraordinary, so let it land, is that the United States government knew that people connected to the Contras were trafficking drugs and looked the other way. This isn't Gary Webb's speculation. In 1989, a Senate subcommittee led by Senator John Kerry investigated and concluded that the Contras were involved in drug trafficking and that the U.S. government had tolerated it in its zeal to fight the Sandinistas. And then, most damningly of all, the CIA investigated itself. After Webb's series caused a firestorm, the CIA's own Inspector General, Frederick Hitz, conducted an investigation and released a report in 1998. And that report, the agency's own internal accounting, admitted that the CIA had worked with and protected dozens of individuals and entities connected to the Contras who were involved in the drug trade. The second volume of the Hitz report identified more than 50 Contras and Contra-related entities implicated in drug trafficking. It found that the CIA had not, in a consistent or timely way, cut off its relationships with people supporting the Contras who were known or alleged to be trafficking drugs. And here is the single most jaw-dropping documented detail, the one that should be taught in every history class. In 1982, the CIA and the Justice Department had a formal understanding, a written agreement in letters between the Attorney General and the CIA, about what crimes the CIA was required to report when committed by its non-employee assets, its agents and contacts, and narcotics violations were left off that list. The CIA was, by formal agreement, not required to report drug trafficking by the people it worked with. Think about what that means. At the very moment cocaine was about to flood American cities, the spy agency running covert operations in the world's biggest cocaine-producing region had a legal arrangement that relieved it of any duty to report the drug crimes of its assets. They built themselves a permission structure to not see it. That is not a theory. That is in the government's own documents. So that is the proven core, and it is staggering. A covert, congressionally banned war, partly sustained by allies who were trafficking cocaine, with a spy agency that had explicitly arranged not to have to report it, all confirmed by the government's own investigations. Now let me tell you what is not proven, because being hard-nosed means being accurate, and the truth doesn't need the exaggeration. There is no solid evidence that the CIA, as an institution, deliberately set out to create the crack epidemic in order to destroy Black communities. That's the version that took hold in popular memory, that this was a genocidal plot intentionally aimed at Black America. Gary Webb himself did not actually claim that. It grew up around his reporting. The documented reality is colder and, in a way, even more damning, because it requires no master plan. The government didn't need to invent crack. It simply decided that fighting communism in Nicaragua was more important than stopping the cocaine its allies were selling. And the people who paid the price for that priority were Black Americans in places like South Central LA, whose neighborhoods were treated as acceptable collateral damage. It wasn't necessarily a plot to destroy them. It was something that, in its own way, is worse. It was indifference. They weren't important enough to protect. Their destruction simply wasn't a high enough priority to interrupt a secret war. And as for the millions the CIA definitely did not make, let's be precise. The point was never that CIA officers got rich personally. The point is that drug money helped finance a war that Congress had explicitly outlawed. The profits didn't fill a spy's pocket. They funded bullets and guns for an illegal covert operation, which is arguably worse. The American government, blocked by its own laws and its own people from funding a war, tolerated a drug pipeline into American cities as one of the ways that war got paid for. The cocaine that wrecked South Central was, in part, a funding source for a foreign policy the public had rejected. Now, what happened to Gary Webb, the man who reported this, is its own dark chapter, and you need to know it. When Dark Alliance came out, instead of being celebrated, Webb was destroyed. The biggest newspapers in the country, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, did not chase the story he'd broken. They turned their firepower on Webb himself, picking apart his framing, attacking his overreach, discrediting him. His own paper, under pressure, backed away from the series. Webb was pushed out of journalism. He couldn't get serious work. His career and reputation were ruined, and in 2004, Gary Webb died by suicide. Here's the bitter epilogue. The 1998 CIA Inspector General report had by then substantially vindicated the core of what he reported, confirming the CIA's protection of drug-connected Contra allies. The man who told an uncomfortable truth was broken for it, while the institutions that buried it moved on. Congresswoman Maxine Waters, representing the very LA communities devastated by crack, became one of the few prominent voices demanding answers and defending Webb's core findings. But the messenger was already destroyed. So that's the first half of the betrayal. The suppliers were protected. Now comes the second half, the half that turned a drug crisis into a generational catastrophe. What the government did to the communities crack landed on. Because while the men at the top of the pipeline were being shielded, the people at the bottom were being hunted. The federal government's response to crack was not treatment, not investment, not addressing the poverty and despair that made the neighborhoods vulnerable. It was punishment on a scale America had never seen, and it was racist in its very design. Here is the clearest, most undeniable piece of evidence that the war on crack was about race, not pharmacology. In 1986, in a frenzy of media panic, supercharged by the death of the college basketball star Len Bias, who actually died from powder cocaine, not crack, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, and that law created what became known as the 100-to-1 disparity. Here's what it meant. To trigger a 5-year mandatory minimum federal prison sentence, you needed to be caught with 500 grams of powder cocaine, or just 5 grams of crack cocaine, 100 times less crack than powder, to get the same mandatory sentence. 5 grams of crack, about the weight of 2 pennies, got you 5 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Now here is the crucial fact. Crack and powder cocaine are pharmacologically the same drug. Crack is just powder cocaine processed with baking soda. Chemically, in their effect, they are essentially identical. There was no scientific basis for punishing one 100 times more harshly than the other. In fact, when Congress picked the 100-to-1 ratio, they did it almost arbitrarily. They'd kicked around other numbers like 20-to-1 and just landed on 100 with no real evidence behind it. So why crack and not powder? Because of who used which. Crack was cheap and it was concentrated in poor black urban neighborhoods. Powder cocaine was expensive, and it was the drug of choice for affluent, largely white users. Wall Street, the suburbs, Hollywood, same drug. But the cheap black version carried a sentence 100 times harsher than the expensive white version. The law took an identical molecule and wrote the racial geography of America directly into the prison sentence. The ACLU and countless others have documented that this single policy did more to deepen racial inequity in the justice system than almost any other, and the enforcement matched the law. In Los Angeles, the LAPD under Chief Daryl Gates declared something close to open war on South Central. This was the era of militarized policing of black neighborhoods, paramilitary gang units, the crash squads, massive sweeps. In 1988, Gates launched Operation Hammer, sending hundreds of officers into South Central in a single weekend to round up young black men en masse, arresting thousands, most of whom were released without charges, but not before being entered into databases, humiliated, and criminalized. The LAPD literally deployed a military-style armored battering ram to smash into suspected crack houses. The neighborhoods crack had already devastated were now occupied territory. Their young men treated as an enemy population. You were poisoned by a pipeline your government protected, and then you were policed like an insurgency for the fallout. Now follow where all those bodies went, because this is where another set of hands reaches into the story to get rich. All those arrests, all those mandatory minimums, all those 5 and 10-year sentences for a few grams of crack, they had to go somewhere, and the American prison population exploded. When Reagan took office in 1980, there were about 329,000 people in American prisons. By the time the war on drugs had run its course, the United States had over 2 million people behind bars, the highest incarceration rate in the world, a roughly 500% increase. The number of people locked up specifically for drug offenses went from around 40,000 to over 450,000, and that explosion fell crushingly, deliberately, on Black Americans. Black men came to be incarcerated at around 7 times the rate of white men. In one stretch between 1986 and 1991, the number of Black women imprisoned for drug offenses rose by over 800%. An entire generation of Black men was pulled out of their communities and warehoused. And understand that the crack versus powder law was just the most visible gear in a much larger machine of bias, because the disparity didn't stop at which drug you used. At every stage of the system, Black Americans are treated more harshly for the same conduct. Study after study, including the government's own sentencing commission, has found that Black men receive significantly longer sentences than white men convicted of the very same crimes, on the order of around 20% longer. They are more likely to be stopped, more likely to be searched, more likely to be arrested, more likely to be charged with the most serious offense available, less likely to be offered a favorable plea, and more likely to be denied bail. So stack it up. You take the cheaper drug, used more in Black neighborhoods because it was all people could afford, and you punish it 100 times harder by law, and then you run it through a justice system that already punishes Black defendants harder at every single step for everything. The 100-to-1 law and the systemic bias don't just add together, they multiply. That is the engine that turned a drug that was chemically identical to a rich man's habit into a generational sentence for the poor and the Black. And warehousing people, it turns out, is a business. Look at the timing, because it is not a coincidence. The first modern private prison company in America, Corrections Corporation of America, now called CoreCivic, was founded in 1983. Right at the dawn of the crack era and the war on drugs. Its competitor, the GEO Group, came along in 1984. These companies were built to do one thing: take government money to lock human beings in cages at a profit. And the war on drugs was the rocket fuel for their entire industry. A flood of prisoners created by racially skewed drug laws became a flood of revenue. The more people America locked up, the more these companies made. Incarceration became an asset class. Wall Street invested. And the incentives, once you create them, are monstrous. You now have powerful corporations with a direct financial interest in keeping prisons full, in harsh sentencing, in policies that put and keep people, disproportionately Black people, behind bars. The bodies crack, and the drug war produced became the inventory of a growth industry. And underneath it all sits a piece of the Constitution most people forget. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as a punishment for crime. Prison labor, incarcerated people working for pennies an hour or nothing, runs on that exception. A system that disproportionately cages Black Americans, extracting their labor for almost nothing, has a historical echo that is impossible to ignore. I want to pause on one more piece of the damage because it shows how the lie compounded the harm. The myth of the crack baby. In the late 1980s, the media filled with terrifying, dehumanizing predictions about a generation of children born to mothers who used crack during pregnancy. Crack babies, who were supposedly irreparably brain damaged, a biological underclass doomed from birth. It was everywhere, presented as scientific fact. And it was, to a large degree, a myth. Long-term studies followed those children and found that the catastrophic predictions were wildly overblown, that the effects of crack exposure in the womb were real but relatively modest, and far smaller than the effects of the poverty those children were actually born into. But the myth did its work. It branded a generation of Black children as damaged goods before they could walk, justified the punishment of their mothers, and reinforced the idea that these were lost people in lost communities. The science was corrected years later. The stigma never fully lifted. So now bring it all the way to today, because the most important thing to understand about the crack era is that it did not end. Its consequences are load-bearing structures in American life right now. That generation of incarcerated Black men came home, those who came home, as felons, into a country that systematically strips felons of opportunity. In many places they couldn't vote, sometimes for life. The war on drugs disenfranchised millions of Black citizens, hollowing out the political power of entire communities. They couldn't easily get jobs, housing, or loans with a record. The children grew up with fathers in prison, with the economic and emotional devastation that absence brings, and that trauma and lost wealth passed down to the next generation. Neighborhoods that were stripped of their working-age men and flooded with addiction and policing never recovered their footing. The racial wealth gap, the distrust between Black communities and the police, the staggering disparities in who America imprisons, these are not separate problems from the crack era. They are, in significant part, its inheritance. There were, eventually, partial corrections, far too late for the people who'd already lost decades of their lives. In 2010, the Fair Sentencing Act finally reduced that obscene 100-to-1 crack powder disparity down to 18-to-1. Better, but still not equal, still encoding the same bias at a lower ratio. In 2018, the First Step Act made that reform retroactive, and several thousand people serving sentences under the old 100-to-1 regime had their sentences cut and were released. People who had been sitting in cells for years under a law everyone now admitted was unjust. Freeway. Rick Ross himself, who'd been sentenced to life in prison, eventually had his sentence reduced and was released, and he became an advocate, speaking about the very system that had used and then caged him. But you cannot give people back 20 lost years. You cannot unraise the children who grew up without their parents. The reforms trimmed the edges off a machine that had already run for a generation. And I want to end on the comparison that lays the whole hypocrisy bare, because you've probably already thought of it. When crack hit Black communities in the 1980s, America's response was handcuffs, mandatory minimums, militarized police, and prison cells. It was treated as a crime, and its victims were treated as criminals. Now look at the opioid epidemic of the last 2 decades, which devastated largely white, often rural and suburban communities. That crisis, which, as we've covered before, was lit by a pharmaceutical company that got a fine, has been treated, rightly, as a public health emergency. The language is about addiction as a disease, about treatment, about compassion, about recovery, about Narcan and rehab and second chances. And that compassion is the correct response to addiction. But notice that Black America didn't get it. Same human affliction, addiction to a drug, and one community got the prison cell, while the other got the treatment center. The crack user got a felony. The opioid user got sympathy. If you ever doubted that the war on drugs was about who was using, and not what they were using, set those 2 responses side by side. The answer is written in the difference. So that is the full, ugly, documented arc. A government that protected a drug pipeline because the men running it were useful to a secret, illegal war. A set of laws designed to punish the cheap Black version of a drug 100 times harder than the expensive white version of the same drug. A police occupation of the communities that pipeline poisoned. A prison industrial complex born in those very years that turned the resulting human wreckage into private profit. And a generation, and their children, and now their children's children, still carrying the cost, while the men at the top of the pipeline walked, and the journalist who tried to tell us was driven to his grave. They will tell you crack was a story about bad choices on inner city corners. It was not. It was a story about choices made in Washington, in Langley, in courtrooms and boardrooms, by powerful people who decided that some Americans were worth protecting and some were worth sacrificing. Freeway. Rick Ross sold the rock. But he didn't fly it in, he didn't write the sentencing laws, and he didn't build the prisons that got rich off the bodies. Remember the names of the people who paid. Not the kingpins and the spies, but the ordinary people of South Central and 100 neighborhoods like it, whose suffering was somebody else's acceptable price. They were told it was their fault. It never was. Thank you for sitting with me here in the quiet dark. If this story made you angry, sit with that anger and learn more. Read Gary Webb. Read the Inspector General's own report. Say these names out loud. Leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one.